If I told you the aesthetics of a Warhammer army was big birdmen, goats, vaguely aquatic creatures, and pink blobs, would you say that's particularly cohesive? Well, not really, no, and this lack of cohesion was one of the main reasons I said I didn't like Tzeentch in my previous video. But on reflection, how wrong I was. This lack of cohesion that exists perfectly reflects what Tzeentch is and how he operates. The change of ways is just that. All about change and evolution, always scheming and influencing anything and everything, to the point where if Tzeentch wants, you'll never know he's actually there at all. Same thing cannot be said for some of the other Chaos Gods, especially Stinky Nurgle. Tzeentch's mastery of the Immaterium and knowledge of all things is pretty badass, and something that is reflected in the Thousand Suns army, a lot of whom are fans of Green Fire and avid readers. So to honour Tzeentch and what he stands for today, I thought I'd paint up the kick-ass GW model, the Winged Demon Prince of Tzeentch. And this very much complements the third-party Demon Prince that I painted in last week's video where I wasn't too hot on Tzeentch. Now, this third-party model is also pretty sweet, so I'd highly recommend checking out that other video if you would like. But anyway, the Tzeentch Demon Prince. As I mentioned, this is a really cool model, and I'm keen for him to be one of the centerpieces for my Thousand Suns. Now, I originally wanted to magnetize his wings so I could swap him out with the standing backpack version, but I absolutely butchered his back when I tried this. I simply didn't line up the magnet holes as well as I should have, to the point where I just decided to not magnetize them and then just glue the wings on tight. RIP me if I ever want a wingless Demon Prince. After assembling and basing him, I had to figure out what sort of colours I wanted to use. Now, I'd obviously would be using the same colours that I'd use for the armour on my other Thousand Suns, so using the metallic blue and the gold, but I wasn't too sure on the flesh or the colour of the wings. Now, I ended up landing on a paint scheme that I feel would contrast quite well with the gold and the blue, and that was through making use of a whole bunch of deep reds and magentas throughout the skin and the wings, and in order to really make those wings pop to that extra level, I decided to give some inks and some fluorescent pinks a go to really make them pop. So having mentioned the wings, that was the first place that I wanted to get started. So after applying a coat of Hull Red to all of the flesh and the wings on the model, I then went in with some violet ink and hit the majority of the flesh of the wings, leaving some of that Hull Red in the recesses. Now, from above, I then airbrushed in some magenta, ensuring that I left some of the lower areas of the wings a bit darker in that violet. Now, in order to reduce the vibrancy of the magenta, which was probably a little bit too much of a step up from what I had initially wanted, I then went in with some red ink. Again, very similar to the magenta, I hit it from above to leave the darker sections unchanged on the lower portions of the wings. Now, pretty happy with the vibrancy of the wings at this point. I then went in with some fluorescent pink, focusing on the higher sections of the wings to again bring that vibrancy up to where I wanted it to be. Now, after I had finished off the main components of the wings, I then had to go in and tackle the muscle that supported the wings. Now, to do that, I went in and painted all of the muscle with the same base coat of Hull Red, and then mixed in some magenta with the Hull Red to help highlight it a bit, but not be as bright or brighter than the actual flesh of the wings. Now, for the horns on the wings, I then went in with some khaki and then mixed in some 1-to-1 khaki and bone white just to add a little bit more highlights, and then hit the metal bits of the wings with some dark gunmetal. Now, with the wings all done, I then moved on to the skin and did a very similar approach to the wing muscle. Using that base of Hull Red, I then slowly worked in more and more magenta to build up the highlights. Now, I went a little bit more with the magenta on the skin because I wanted to push the highlights a little bit more than what I had on the muscle of the wings, which had already kind of been highlighted by the fleshy fluorescent pink that surrounded them. Now with the flesh all done, I then moved on to the armor, and very similar to the technique that I've used for all my Thousand Suns, I painted the armor with some of Vallejo's True Metallic Metal Sapphire Blue, and then hit the trim of all the armor with some glorious gold. Now, having done that, I moved on to the cloth, and for the cloth, I started with a base of steel grey, and then started layering in more and more off-white to help build up that transition from darkness to light, from the recesses to the exposed areas of the cloth. With the cloth all done, then I moved on to bone, which again I did with the khaki and the bone white mix, some of the piping, which I did with some Black Templar contrast paint, and then the metal, which I did with some dark gunmetal. And all with that done, it was ready to prepare the oil wash. Now, I've spoken pretty extensively about washes in the past, and I'm going to go on about them again because they're so fantastic, because they're such an easy way to add a whole lot of depth to an otherwise flat paint job. And I absolutely love them. In this case, like my other Thousand Suns, I use a mix of ABT's Burnt Umber and Ivory Black in a 3-to-1 mix, mixing it with AK Interactive's White Spirits. After having mixed it, sloshed it all over the model. Again, as I said before, it might look a little bit daunting and seem that I've ruined the paint job, but rest assured it will all work out. So after having absolutely saturated them, left them for 30 minutes to let the oils really start to tone some of the paint as well as get into all the recesses. But after having left for 30 minutes, then I'll go back in with some makeup applicators to take off any of that excess, focusing on ensuring that the exposed areas have no or very little oil wash on them, and leaving the oil wash in the recesses. Now, in some places, I dunked the makeup applicators into White Spirits to take off even more of the oil wash, and that was on some of the really exposed areas. So especially around the wings, which obviously very high on the model, and as such would be getting more light than some of the other areas. Now, after taking all of the excess oil that I wanted to take off, I left him overnight to let the oils cure before jumping back in to make some finishing touches to really make the model pop. Now, firstly, I added some white ink to the eyes, the sword, and the big glowy rune on his armor. Then went in with an airbrush to add some additional white ink around these areas. This will give us a good base to start adding some light with fluorescent and inks later on. Now, with the white ink down and dusted, it was time to hit those same areas with some fluorescent green. Now, the whole idea with this was to hopefully read as glowing eyes, glowing runes, and a glowing sword, which I hope would be pushed a little bit further by adding some bounce light on some of the areas likely to be being hit by some of that light. So you can see I've done this on his wings and other areas that are directly facing the blade, so a little bit on his flesh, as well as some of the armor panels that are directly across from it. With the model all but sorted, it was time to move on to the base. Now, I've got a pretty simple approach with this, and again I use it for all of my Thousand Suns, but starting with Vallejo Earth on the sand and dark blue grey for the rocks. Follow this up with a wash of non-oil on the rocks and Agrax on all of the sand. Now, after those washes have dried, we'll then come back in with a dry brush of those same base colours before then applying a smaller dry brush of Playground on the sand and Stonewall Grey on the rocks. Now, closing in on the finish line, add some cute little flowers from Gamer Grass, rim the base with some charcoal, give him a gloss varnish, and waboom! He's all done. I have thoroughly enjoyed painting this model, and having not really painted wings before, it was a really good opportunity for me to test out some new ideas and techniques I really wanted to give a go. And honestly, I think it came out pretty well. And whilst I think the transition from the top of the bottom to the wings is pretty sick, going from like the pink fluoro all the way down to the whole red with the violet ink on it, I think I definitely overdid it with the fluoro green bounce light from the sword onto the inside of the wings. I think regardless, it still looks pretty good, and really it's all just a learning experience, right? So I think in this case, learning that less is very much more, where in fact, I've done the very much opposite of that. But regardless, I think it's still a really cool model, and I've thoroughly enjoyed painting him. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and have a great rest of your day. Until next time, see ya!